Thank you, Chloe. Always great. So we'll have our first panel of today. Again, we actually will refrain from calling them panels. We'll call them round tables because, again, while we may have session chairs and the main discussants, everyone here is subject matter experts in their own right. Everyone has something to share, add. Might be notes, might be comments, might be experiences. So I'd like to call the next round of main discussants. And again, Chloe, you're coming back up here, unfortunately, as one of the session chair. So please, again, if there's any point in time that you want to say something, we will be holding a Q&A per se. You just put your hand up, we come around with a microphone, say something. So please, main discussants, come to the table. We are kind of modeling out a few ideas where we may have discussants embedded within the group of discussants, but I think this room is a bit more intimate, so we can be happy to have this very even governance right here. Great. Bill, perfect. And you can go here.
Yeah.
Done.
It'd be easy for me to see my notes from here.
Go for it. So good? All right. Cool.
Get my germs all over it.
I know that you guys must really like me because you've given me the best set of non-panelists here, discussants. So I just want to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and what you're working on for to help shape some context around the comments that you're going to make. So this panel is all about decentralized versus centralized approaches to primary issuance. And so what we imagine by that is stablecoin, central bank digital currencies, but this also extends into tokenized deposits and tokenized real world assets or other financial assets. There are governance and security challenges that need to be addressed on the decentralized and centralized sides. So this is really what we want to unearth at the start of the day today. And I think a lot of the themes that emerge in this conversation will be really critical for the workshops to come. So we have Will Remor from MakerDAO, Michaela Juric from Novatti's AUDD stablecoin, and Mark Staples from CSIRO Data 61 and the Digital Finance CRC CTO. But could each of you just take a couple of minutes to share what your roles are in each of those projects, and then I'll ask you to go into more detail on some of these key topics. You've got the microphone, Mark. We'll start with you.
Great. So the Digital Finance TRC is a new research centre with industry and government funding and industry participants. And we're looking to enable greater tokenisation of things that are not currently liquid or tradable in the economy. So it's going to be tokenising real world assets. So a recent project that we've done was the first project we did over the last year was doing a trial of a real CBDC issued by the Reserve Bank of Australia, which ran for a limited period of time and then has since stopped. The reason we're interested in that is because it's an important settlement asset for the financialization of digital assets.
Thank you, Michaela.
Hi, my name is Michaela. I'm from Novatti. Novatti is an ASX-listed company based out of Melbourne, Australia, and we issue AUDD, which is an Australian dollar stablecoin, which is one-to-one backed by Australian dollars. So we launched in November 2022, so about 12 months into our market foray, and we natively issue on Stellar, XRP Ledger, and Ethereum.
So I'm William. I've worked for now a number of years with different decentralized communities, the most significant one being MakerDAO. Maker is a decentralized issuer of a DAI, which is stable coin, originally backed by just the Ethereum network, the Ether and the Ethereum network, and that has evolved since its launch in 2017. The project officially launched in 2017, even though it's been building since 2014, and has significantly changed over the last 5 years of its history. And we can talk about a lot of that during the conversation today.
Thank you so much, Will. Would you mind passing the mic back to Mark? Mark, can you kick us off by sharing with everybody here, how have the roles that you've been involved with shaped your views on this whole debate of centralized versus decentralized governance approaches?
Yeah, so I guess maybe early on, my involvement with blockchain was essentially as a kind of new technology component in the design of systems. So I was taking a kind of very sort of software technical perspective on that. And I guess what's changed over the time is I've sort of grown to understand the importance of the organizational level or multi-stakeholder governance of these decentralized networks. And then, you know, naturally you think, oh, well, the network is decentralized, so therefore all these tokens running on it, they're also kind of decentralized as well. But then the next evolution of my thinking was that's not kind of true. All tokens are centralized, basically, even when they're running on decentralized networks, because, you know, they're all issued by a party. A token is something that represents rights, and those rights are the rights issued by or claimed by the issuer of the token. So, yeah, my thinking's come back full circle in a way. Even though there is a lot of value for having these decentralized platforms, tokens are all centralized. That's my contentious claim for the day.
Kicking off nice and spicy first thing in the morning. I love it. So actually this echoes some comments that were made by Amanda Wick on panels yesterday afternoon, expressing some cynicism around DAOs, which are obviously really relevant to these decentralized models. So Mark, it sounds like what you're saying is that you're differentiating between the centralization of the assets themselves versus how centralized or decentralized on a spectrum the governance around those assets may be?
Yes, that's right. The tokens are kind of a thing that represents rights usually, yeah. And the creation of those rights is the tokenization process and attaching it to the token, and that's always a kind of a centralized, almost always a centralized thing.
And Will, did you have the mic because you were going to clap back? Are you in defense of DAOs?
Just pass the mic between us. But I understand actually the point where you're coming from. In terms of, I think the distinction here is not so much on the stable coin mechanism itself, but more around the governance actually mechanism that is utilized and how actually the governance is applied, right? Even though at some points in time you do have across different decentralized communities different ways of actually ensuring that actually the distribution of that governance, and it's not going to be always fully kind of like centralized across a number of founders and groups of people, kind of like that are the start of a project. And it also might be completely on the other end, where the project actually might define from the get-go for governance mechanisms to kind of like distribute across a number of addresses that might not be related. So it's not, there's always going to be a spectrum of activities depending on the project. So that's why I think it's really hard actually to apply necessarily a blanket approach when it comes to the determination of governance centralization of some of those projects. Yeah.
Michaela, would Novatti consider transitioning from ASX listed to DAO governed?
That's probably a question for the powers that be, not necessarily the head of blockchain and digital assets. I guess when we focus on governance as a stablecoin issuer, our I guess key mark is looking at how the tokens are actually issued, as opposed to I guess who's doing the issuing. So one of the key things that we really had to look at was the security risks around issuance. What stops somebody from, if you've got single key signing, for example, which a lot of the major stablecoin issuers currently have, what stops someone from hacking into their system and just printing money? And so for that, we were like, okay, well, to prevent that, we'll move to a multi-signature approach where it's, you know, you need some sort of consensus to mint the stable coins. Well, then you sort of have an inefficiency block if someone comes through and says, okay, I want to mint, X amount of stable coins or X amount of AUDD at 4 o'clock in the morning, I can tell you now I'm not going to be impressed, and neither are the other signatures if they have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to mint that transaction. So one of the things we looked at was doing a governance-based issuance, where instead of having, I guess, a vote of different participants, it's actually a vote of the party, or what we call the distributor, in order to access the AUDD that they're looking to attain. And that's based on a risk-based profile that we establish for them. So we have a governance token that sits in the middle of our stablecoin called AUDR. And AUDR is issued to the distributor based on the risk profile that we set for them. So if we can see that, they have a potential of minting $20 million a month, for example, we will issue them with 20 million AUDR, and that has a 1-to-1 rate to AUDD. And then utilizing some on-chain functions, whether it's depending on the blockchain, so it'll either be Ethereum contract, or with Stellar and XRP Ledger, it's set up on the DEX because that's based at an on-chain level. That AUDR can be swapped for AUDD, but it's more of a swap mint. So it's like the AUDR will burn and the AUDD will mint. And so there's two components to that. One, it allows for essentially single key issuance, which keeps that efficiency going. But also it mitigates our risk in that no one can really hack in per se and just start minting an infinite amount of coins. They're limited to the AUDR that we issue. So if there's only 20 million AUDR that's in existence, well, then that nefarious party that comes in is limited to only printing 20 million AUDD, which mitigates our risk of infinite issuance. And that's patent pending, by the way.
So can we take some comments? I'm sure there must be a couple of comments and questions. Please.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Steve Wilson from Lockstep Consulting in Australia. Wanted to, for what it's worth, echo what Mark said. I think it's said really rarely that tokenization is intrinsically central. There's always a single point of failure. There's always a trusted role. There's always a source of truth, a singular source of truth. So I don't know what a distributed ledger tells you that the central tokenizer couldn't already tell you. But to be less vague, on Chloe's point about, are we talking about decentralization of assets or decentralization of governance? I go back to the original blockchain, or Ethereum for that matter, and say there is actually no asset on that thing. It's pure. It's all about moving ownership of something that is purely digital. There is no asset. That's the beauty of Bitcoin. It doesn't actually exist. And so there's a construct around its value. And therefore, there is no difference between asset and governance on what I think is the pure public sort of blockchain. So when you say decentralization of assets versus governance, it seems to me that you're always going to add another layer of meaning. When you tokenize, another layer of meaning, the representation of an asset on the blockchain all of a sudden becomes concrete, but it only becomes concrete through the action of a single point of authority. And I think the magic of blockchain disappears. The magic of consensus disappears as soon as the tokenizer is saying those ones and zeros relate to gold or sneakers or Australian dollars.
Yeah, what I said was trying to be contentious. And I think, in a sense, tokens are always centralized for the primary issuance, right? But what the value you get out of a decentralized platform is in the kind of secondary market and the use of the tokens, the exchange. Like, who owns what token in a decentralized token is usually not sort of controlled by the issuer. That's more decentralized. It can depend on the token. Yeah, I think there is still a lot of value in decentralization for tokens. Yeah. The thing you say about there not being assets on ledgers, I mean, to me, an asset is just something that has value. And, it's hard to say that Bitcoin and Ethereum doesn't have value. So, to say that there are, and so I think tokens can have value. And part of the value of a token is because of the rights it gives you access to. And the underlying rights have value. But if the access to those rights is through the token, then the token also has value. So the token is also an asset, in my view. You said a lot of things. I've responded to two of them.
Thanks, Stephen, for that. Would you mind passing the microphone 2 doors down? We had another question coming over here.
Hi, this is Jamie from Pragmatic Blockchain Research. I'm not sure if this is a question maybe for later on, but Michaela, on the stablecoin product that you have, could you just maybe drill a little bit more into detail? I didn't quite catch the issuance part. So I understand the mechanism between the governance token and the issuance, but the person who's actually engaging with that governance token, is that approved counterparties?
Yes.
Or it's not? And is this an institutional only type stablecoin product, or is it in the wild for retail?
No, it's well, both. It's, you know, it's available for institutional, it's also available for retail, but in terms of who's interacting with that governance token, it is approved distributors that we onboard to our platform.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Thank you for that. And Michaela, you mentioned about the security challenge being a really primary concern for Novatti and the problem that you really wanted to solve as a priority. We can acknowledge there are a lot of different types of security challenges in issuance of assets on chain. There's cybersecurity and smart contract security, governance security in the sense of potential collusion of counterparties, the identity security of the participants in the network, managing conflicts of interest, and also governance in PEG stability to the reference asset in the case of an underlying asset or derivative type object on chain. So I'm interested to get a view from each of the discussants here. Are these challenges equal across the spectrum of your organizations? What kind of keeps you up at night, and how do you think that decentralized or centralized approaches might open you to certain strengths or weaknesses in trying to mitigate some of these risks?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. So first on the PEG stability, I think this is a really key one when it comes to decentralized actually primary issuance of stable coins, and especially the way that actually being evolved. So can mention for a fact in the case of like MakerDAO, so you require a reference and just a network of oracles, right, that need to be maintained for the reference to an underlying value on an underlying asset that is soft pegged to the US dollar, which is actually very different from other types of actually issuances, or which is kind of like, it's not algorithmic in the way that Terra and Luna was, because it still has a full backing of other assets, right? But the way that actually ensure that in the case, and is quite different from a more like a primary issuance from a centralized marketplace. If you do have to maintain a certain level of over-collateralization of the assets, right? Because otherwise, with a volatility of the underlying assets that happen, actually the protocol itself actually could go underwater relatively quickly. And above that, you also have mechanisms for, other than the over-collateralization aspect, you also have mechanisms in terms of like market demand for the underlying stablecoin. You need to make sure that actually the market demand doesn't explode and causes actually supply and demand imbalance, in which case then, similar fashion to what the central bank would actually have to do to predict, to prevent inflation or deflation of the assets, you need actually to prop up actually through interest rate mechanisms actually to ring in demand or to lose the strap. So actually MakerDAO in its history, at some point in time, people actually don't recall that anymore because this is really starting to date. But in 2018, we had interest rates of 20% on the assets that actually were held on the Maker protocol. But we've implemented a number of mechanisms, including actually onboarding other stable coins into the protocol to ensure that there was actually a significant amount amount of liquidity available for actually for removing actually those problems around the peg. When you could talk about PEG, of course, you go into Oracle and Oracle infrastructure, which you mentioned. Another actually important point, decentralized, decentralized actually is smart contract driven protocol, because you're expecting the smart contracts actually to self-execute without necessarily an intermediary actually kind of like regulating through a whitelisting of governance the smart contract, and that requires you to have a very robust actually Oracle infrastructure that is actually not manipulated. Because if the pricing mechanism of the Oracle becomes manipulated or is exploited to that mechanism, actually the whole ecosystem actually can go down. So Maker, and that's very different from other protocols, has on top of utilizing third-party Oracle providers like Chainlink and the ones that actually everybody uses, it also has developed its own network of oracles to make sure that there was actually multi-oracle framework that could be utilized to prevent oracle manipulation into their contract. So there's a whole set of mechanisms that actually are quite different, and where the risks and the severity of the risks, if they get exploited, are much higher than in a more centralized and governance process.
Thank you.
So in terms of, I guess, shared risks that sort of get incurred by all of us here as different providers, I mean, I think we all sort of have our own, I think the risks are pretty generalized and pretty the same. Obviously, it just affects us in different ways because obviously we're doing different types of issuance. In terms of, I guess, what keeps me up at night, there's a few things. One's my cat, but that's a different story. But I guess to your point around market stabilization and ensuring that you retain value to what you're representing. So I guess as a centralized or privatized issuer that's issuing based on a centralized asset, we maintain, I guess, what we would call our primary market, and that's AUD to AUDD, and we're doing one-to-one minting and also a one-to-one burning as well, so purchase and sales. So it's always going to be one-to-one there. It then becomes a question of how you maintain that in a secondary market and whose responsibility that is, because it can come at two different angles. The first one is that is it the issuer's responsibility to maintain the price of the token within secondary markets? Well, if you think about how many secondary markets actually exist within the Web3 world, especially with decentralized exchanges, to try and cover every single exchange would just be so difficult and very inefficient. There would, sure, we have aggregators and whatnot that would probably make that process a lot easier. But this idea of having to try and maintain a peg as the issuer would be very difficult. There also then gets raised the issue around market manipulation as well. So if you look at the issuance of USDT, for example, USDT was actually, they started issuing that in 2015, and not many people knew about it. And if you look at the charts and the stats of the assets under management with Tether, it was nothing. It was very benign up until 2017 when they finally listed it on their own exchange, Bitfinex, and obviously caused that sort of first bull run of 2017 with Bitcoin, where the price completely bumped up, and then USDT became almost this household name for trading. Ever since then, I guess Tether and Bitfinex have never been able to shake this reputation that they ultimately manipulated their own market and created and it's not adequately backed, and obviously there's a number of other reputational issues there. So that was one thing that obviously we wanted to try and avoid as an issuer. But at the same time, there are calls to us to sort of almost act like almost like a central bank to ensure that we are avoiding issues of inflation and whatnot in those secondary markets. I think that there was a report recently released. I'm not too sure if it was, I think it was the Bank of International Settlements, which really went out and completely sort of poo-pooed the idea of stable coins, privately issued stable coins, and you know about the peg of the price in secondary markets, and I think one thing that needs to be taken into consideration with that is latency premium. So everyone talks about stable coins being a more efficient mechanism to, you know, for cross-border remittance and FX and whatnot. It then becomes a question of, okay, well, how much are you willing to pay for that premium of getting your transaction from point A to point B within, you know, 15 minutes as opposed to 3 to 5 business days? And the answer is that most people are willing to pay more for that service. And so then that ultimately gets factored into the price. And so because of that, you will see a bit of I guess, a spread between traditional markets and decentralized markets, because there is that ability to do things a lot more quicker.
Mark, a central bank must have a lot of advantages on the risks that Will and Michaela have raised.
Yeah, so I guess when I think about security as a computer scientist, I think about it in terms of the sort of classic CIA properties: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. For availability, you know, the public blockchain networks have been running for, you know, at the network level, been running for like a decade or whatever.
Yeah.
Spectacular levels of availability. But for tokens running on those, and they also inherit those kind of about 24/7, you know, never goes down sort of properties, unless your token smart contract has a bug and then ends up in some state that's, you know, locked. And then it's hard to fix that kind of thing. So that's kind of one of the risks, and which brings me to integrity. So that's one of the sort of integrity properties, is that it's kind of hard to change the code once it's deployed. And you know, that integrity is, I guess, the kind of main security property that these blockchain networks are trying to provide. But when you think about at the token level, part of the integrity of a token is not just in the sort of the information integrity or the process integrity of the token on chain, but also the integrity of the backing for the token. So what are the rights being backed by the token, and is there integrity in that backing claim? So when Will's talking about, you know, these fancy Oracle networks that are having more reliability, that's trying to ensure the integrity of the claim. So the tokenization process, it doesn't just stop at issuance. In this case, it's something that needs to be maintained, and the integrity of that claim needs to be maintained over time. And that's also what Michaela is talking about, you know, with this minting process that she was talking about before, is maintaining the integrity of this over time. The last one, confidentiality, in a sense, and privacy. There's no confidentiality and privacy risks on blockchain, because there is no confidentiality or privacy on blockchain. It's all very transparent. There's no risk of it not being. You know, and that, I guess that's that's one of the advantages of centralization, is it's much more straightforward to support privacy, because you can just put a little firewall on the front and you can just gate who has access to what when. And, you know, if you're thinking about a central bank digital currency, you know, part of the clue is in the name central bank. You can just run that in principle as just a central web service, centralized web service. And then in principle, you can have much cleaner, more powerful, fine-grained privacy.
I have a strong sense that some of our identity people in the room might want to challenge you on that point. And Michaela's busting to
Sorry. Yeah, I know. Sorry.
While we wait for other discussants to mentally prepare themselves to comment.
No, I just wanted to hijack your point real quick, because you're starting to talk about integrity. And one thing that, you know, is been up for debate around the issuance of our stablecoin, I guess we'll call it ethical integrity. If you look at the issuance of, I guess, USDT and USDC, a few of them at the contract level will allow the issuer to freeze a balance from being transacted. So if there is, you know, if there is a belief that there is, you know, USDC, for example, that is in the ecosystem that is being used for a nefarious purpose, then the issuer has the ability to freeze that balance and stop that user from transacting. Now, I guess the pro there's a bit of an argument there to be had, right? Because when we often think of digital assets, we often think of them as public permissionless assets that no one can control and no one can stop or freeze. And so to give that power to an issuer, it then also comes with a fair amount of liability. You know, if there is somebody doing something sinister with your stable coin, are you required as the issuer to step in and do something about it and stop it? You know, or is it a matter of, you know, do you wait for a subpoena to come through from law enforcement? You know, anyone that's, you know, worked in the financial crimes scene for long enough will know that those things can come relatively slow. So it's, you know, do you act first and then wait for, you know, ask for forgiveness as opposed to permission, that kind of mindset. You know, so there's, you know, but at the same time though, you know, when we look at, you know, that liability aspect, you know, you could almost apply the same component to cash. And I know it's probably going to get a bit dark, but it's, you know, whenever you see like, you know, drug raids on the news, for example, and there's, you know, these stacks of cash everywhere, it's, you know, should there be a liability on the, you know, on the Perth Mint or the RBA or whoever's, you know, issuing those notes? You know, should they have known, should they have, you know, some sort of a liability in, you know, the fact that their instrument was used in the proceeds of crime? So it opens up to a very interesting argument.
I'm seeing some ears up in the crowd.
Is any other comments?
Yeah, so my question is around, and I guess this would be interesting to see the conversation with basket-backed stablecoins as opposed to sort of single currency-backed stablecoins. Is that something that sort of the main discussants are thinking about, especially with MakerDAO? I remember having a great conversation with you, Will, about this a couple months ago. So I sort of wanted to open to that because it might actually allow for us to get closer to something that isn't just a binary decentralized versus centralized issuance.
Yeah, it's a great point actually. And I, to a large extent, actually, I'm increasingly a believer in that in that direction. So the very first version of DAI, it was the most, I guess, purest version of that, you know, full integrity, full transparency that you're contemplating, full availability of data, because it was really about utilizing a highly liquid asset, Ether, to be the single asset actually that could ever be utilized to mint DAI. And other projects in the DeFi space have since then taken some of that role, and Maker has essentially evolved from there into multi-currency backing and even, you know, tokenized reward assets off-chain kind of structures, right? So, but the more time passes, the more I still feel like that original view of having one stable coin that is actually fully kind of like backed by a single, always traded, always on asset like Ether, it was actually still kind of like the most pure and the most transparent way. Because once you go from there to what's actually tokenized reward assets, you start actually kind of being in between the two worlds, in between like a more permissioned, structured world where actually that data and availability of that data and the integrity of data is not as clear as that one that actually originally have. So, for example, other versions of it that now exist and have a certain market cap are Liquidity, Rye, which was actually also some creators of the original Maker protocol that actually moved on to move back to the original versions of Maker. And I think I've been seeing also a few discussions around federated models for issuance of stablecoins, which is something actually really gets me excited about, because it's about being able to individually assign a stable coin to a vote to a user or a group of users, which is actually really kind of like a powerful concept. If you start imagining that the fungibility between those different stable coins can either be, you know, fully fungible and actually tradable, or can be assumed based on, say, the the credit risk of the underlying asset that actually that's assumed. And then you start actually creating a whole different market. I'm really passionate about that part around like federation, but haven't seen projects to scale yet in that space. If there's anyone in the room that is actually thinking about those things, I would like actually to have a chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess as a fiat-backed stablecoin, systemic risk or centralization risk is something that we do consider quite heavily as a part of our issuance. And it's funny that the deeper you go down that rabbit hole, the more I sort of become pro DAI and pro decentralized backing. But I guess inherently, it's a bit of a different system within Australia compared to other markets as well, which sort of makes some factors of diversifying your backing a bit more difficult. So, for example, we've got the fiat one-to-one backing piece. We're relatively safe in terms of how banks are operated here in Australia. They're backed by the financial claim scheme up to about 250,000, but obviously that only saves us up to 250,000, which if you go up double that, then half of it's backed, half of it's not. We are going down the road of looking at treasury bonds, treasury notes, but ascertaining those sort of financial instruments is very different to how it's ascertained in the States, for example. So in America, people can just go directly to the treasury in the States and buy bonds directly, and they can buy and sell them one-to-one. Whereas here in Australia, the majority of the market is facilitated through secondary markets. And so purchasing those bonds or treasury notes, they have their own fluctuations in them. So you can buy 100 notes, whatever it is, for 149,000 one week, but then the next week it may be 148,000, which means you decrease your circle, like how the stablecoin is back. So there's different considerations there that need to be taken in place. I mean, we also joined the DFCRC pilot program, and we looked at doing a CBDC backed stablecoin, which also opens up another realm of unique use cases, because you essentially created a synthetic CBDC. So it was a CBDC that could travel on, you love that terminology, don't you, Mike? So which allowed you to, I guess, where it was sort of issued on EVM-based technology, we were able to, mint our stablecoin on Stellar. So it created, I guess, more efficiency in how the asset could move around in the market, and created more use cases in terms of how that asset could interact with other use cases that otherwise couldn't interact with a privately issued stablecoin.
Just one quick comment there. It was a stat that I think Amanda Wick told me yesterday. Issuers of stable coins are actually, I think, the 17th largest holder of US Treasury bonds now, which I find quite fascinating for sort of this conversation, of course.
I think part of the answer comes to thinking about what is a stable coin, and I don't know if there's a good definition yet, but I'm hoping to create one in the International Standards Joint Working Group on digital currencies when it gets formed. No, it's in train.
We could get started at BGIN.
Yeah. So my view, anyway, currently tentative view, is that a stable coin is a coin whose goal is to have a stable value relative to some reference asset, and so so tokenized bank deposit is a stable coin. Algorithmic stablecoins, stablecoin, basket-backed stablecoins, they're all stablecoins. They're all aiming to have this sort of stable value relative to a reference asset. The CBDC is not a stablecoin, despite Chloe's introduction this morning, I think, because it's not with reference to an asset. It is the asset in that case. So I think it's a special case. There's different ways of creating stablecoins. Individually, kind of dollar backed with commercial bank money, or baskets of assets. Even if it is kind of backed with individual commercial bank money, if you look through a bank account, it's just a basket of assets on the other end as well. So, I don't know.
We've got about 4 minutes left. So whatever are your burning questions or comments, please.
I just have a naive question. In a world of stablecoins, do we actually need a CBDC?
Love that question.
That's
what would be a use case
a
that
great question.
where CBDC would be useful?
Yeah.
You couldn't fulfill with a stable coin.
That's such a good question, and that was one of the goals of our research project of having the Reserve Bank issue a real CBDC in Australia, was to explore what other use cases for a CBDC. In Australia, we already have a well-functioning payment system. We have financial inclusion, 24/7 real-time account-to-account payments, all of that stuff. Why would you need a CBDC? What business use cases could be enabled by it? And in particular, then, if we already have stable coins, what does the CBDC add over and above a stable coin? So I guess read the report for the detailed answer. But the CBDC that was issued had a lot of kind of limitations in terms of functionality. But and so a lot of people in our project ended up creating CBDC-backed stablecoins because their stablecoin had more features. Flexibility was more programmable. You could attach it to other sort of asset tokens and so on. That wasn't possible with the core CBDC. But nonetheless, the CBDC played a role in being a kind of a risk-free asset for backing and for settlement. And also, I think has a lot of potential for enabling stablecoin interchange as well, if you have multiple stablecoins all denominated in the same fiat currency. So I think there is a role for a CBDC in helping to enable stablecoin ecosystems.
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. And to be honest, the way that I look at it, the more time passes, really like through the mechanism of money transmission action and how money actually transmits in a very interoperable way, to your point, earlier across the economy. Right now, one of the key problems that most stablecoin issues, not Maker, decentralized forms of primary issues, but like more the centralized type of like stablecoins, is the problem of counterparty risk, right? That we've seen earlier in this year through circle depegging, which actually affected Maker and DAI as well. But I think this is one problem which actually comes down to the financial market infrastructure and what is actually acceptable under the financial market infrastructure. There is not a single jurisdiction, to my understanding, that actually allows a stablecoin issuer to be within the realm of exchange settlement accounts that actually are held at the central bank, right? Which is actually a problem for intermediation and a problem for market stability in the long run. So if that were to change, maybe the conversation of do we have that mechanism, that initial issuer mechanism of transmission, is that a necessary thing? Maybe not, but to the extent that we are working on today, that basis, I think that that CBDC, wholesale CBDC, as the original monetary money transmission mechanism is still necessary in the long run to ensure actually market stability.
I guess to answer your question, I'll quickly ask Mark a question. From the point of inception of you guys wanted to do a CBDC pilot to actually carrying out the pilot, how long was that period of time? Are we talking a few years, a few months?
Yeah, the Reserve Bank had already done a number of projects leading, not through the DFCRC, but separately in the years beforehand. And so it's kind of hard to say where the journey starts. But to actually deploy a platform and implement an ERC20 token and, do the security reviews and it turned out that getting the legal side, because it was a real liability of the Reserve Bank, that was where all the difficulties and challenges and learnings was on legal and regulatory issues, not really technical issues. It's less than 2 years, more than a year, or something the ballpark of a year, I guess.
So I guess if you look at how long it took them to get from the point of inception to actually conducting the pilot, and then look at what happened, I guess, in the more private market with fintechs and how much we were able to change, and how much we were able to develop and innovate in the private space at the same time. It would be like saying we're going to task the RBA with developing something like Square or Stripe. I just don't think the government's in a position to innovate because they are held up by things like regulators and whatnot. And so they just don't have that agility to move and develop. So while I think there is a place for CBDCs, I think stable coins are going to, hold their place in terms of being innovative, being able to innovate and actually grow and actually get that real world, use case adoption.
This will be the final comment.
Okay. The government, the Reserve Bank, runs the fast settlement system that's underneath the new payments platform that gives us the 24/7 real-time to account payments in Australia. I don't know if that's innovative or not, but they run it and it usually doesn't fall over. And that's, I guess, something that government just tries to do is kind of support innovation, develop infrastructure, but it needs to kind of be stable and effective as well. They're doing the consumer data right, which is new ways of doing consented data sharing in the economy in various sectors. So, arguably that's supporting innovation. Arguably it's not fast enough, but on the other hand, it's trying to be more stable as well.
Our discussants are so entertaining that the organisers have given us permission to go 5 minutes over time. I've got a million questions, and I know you guys all do as well. I can feel the thoughts in your head. Let's take a question from here.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe you can illuminate what actually a CBDC on a blockchain looks like. Who are the nodes? Why do we even need a blockchain? And when you're starting to talk about stablecoins backed by a CBDC, then are we not starting to move into the realm of a retail CBDC, in which case transactions and details of everything that is done with that stablecoin has got to pass through back to the central bank?
Okay, there's a lot of misconceptions in that question, so I'm not quite sure where to start. So it is true, central bank digital currency, as I said before, clue is in the name central, wouldn't need to be on a decentralized blockchain. And in fact, for our pilot, although on the back end, we actually did use blockchain software because we were doing that to reduce the interoperability and onboarding time for the ecosystem that was already very familiar with how to integrate with an Ethereum blockchain. So that was part of the reason for why, but it was run as a centralized service. And there are other platforms like Project Hamilton out of the US that is a CBDC software that envisages running a CBDC as a centralized service. Might still be cryptographically controlled tokens, but with a kind of centralized service. So yeah, CBDCs don't need to be on a blockchain. It's possible countries might issue a CBDC as a centralized service, but then also issue another form of a CBDC on a blockchain. And maybe they would do that in the context of cross-border payments where there's multiple jurisdictions involved and they want to support more decentralized governance for cross-border payments. And then, so interestingly, although China, for example, has a centralized CBDC that they're trialing in various regions now, they're part of their experiments for cross-border CBDC is with a blockchain-based platform where you have nodes running in different countries. To the extent that, so my experience of central banks is they totally do not want to be involved in customer service. They do not want to know about the details of anyone's transactions. They want to know, governments want to be able to make sure that crime and terrorist financing isn't happening in countries, and so they want there to be mechanisms for investigating and enforcing those issues. But the idea that just because you had a central CBDC-backed stablecoin, that the stablecoin would then also have the same level of access and controls is, I think, misguided. Because if the CBDC is a pooled backing for a stablecoin, which many of them were in our project, then there's no kind of straightforward link between those two. The only link would be through the records held by the stablecoin operator. And so that would come down to questions about access to information from the stablecoin operator, a lot of which is publicly visible on the most public blockchains anyway.
Yeah, I think your question there in the evolution of the Maker protocol actually might give you a bit of like an insight into maybe how CBDCs actually will evolve over time. In exactly the same line of thought to what Mark was saying. So Maker, when it started actually kind of like creating a multi-asset backed kind of like stable coin and start actually evolving because of the community, because multiple people were actually interacting with the governance protocol. There was all sorts of exotic kind of people saying, hey, you've got, tokenized wine and tokenized kind of art. Can we back that with Maker? Can do all sorts of things. And again, in the same line of thought, Maker didn't have like an interest in becoming an underwriter for every single type of credit that came to the protocol. So instead, what it developed is this mechanism of, again, of money transmission to allow liquidity to go out into third-party protocols. One of these money transmission mechanisms is called the D3M, which is still actually very active today, and therefore actually distributed open actually channels for liquidity to go into protocols like Aave and Compound and others, which then themselves were a little bit more specialized in trying actually to find and sourcing, pools of capital that were in need, rather than actually MakerDAO trying actually to underwrite every single, didn't have like any intention to become like a commercial bank or any sort. So to your point, again, very similar in the way that they're actually thinking. Again, use case. Another thing around the CBDC and that like the cash, kind of like cash mechanism of transmission across the economy, they can see a potential like long-term benefit is at the moment there's a whole bunch of projects all over the world kind of like developing tokenization for this and tokenization for that. When you actually look under the hood for most of those projects, the Frankenstein kind of market infrastructure that is behind it, between things actually happening on chain and off chain, is horrendous. And that's going to create a lot of friction, especially because everybody's kind of like developing things into hubs of permission chains and this and that, and like in the whole promise of efficiency of the markets. I don't really believe in that. However, in a future mechanism where you have actually that mechanism of transmission that is trusted potentially on a blockchain, you can start thinking that actually the assets such as bonds and the like can actually be issued natively on chain. That's a significant benefit to the market infrastructure that we are currently building live, and there's a lot of investors actually putting money on the table for that kind of stuff, which I don't really believe that in the long term will create a very efficient market. But we'll probably have lots of those.
Let's continue this afternoon. I've written down a whole bunch of questions that I'm dying to ask you, and I'm going to reserve them for the stablecoin workshop, where we'll have 90 minutes to really go deep into a lot of this stuff. And to Stephen's comment earlier, the title of our working paper is Points of Failure. So it'll be really rich discussion. Looking forward to exploring all of these themes with you over the coming days. Joey's going to come and introduce the next panel, but please give a round of applause to our fantastic discussants.